The carriage turned off the post road at 3:15, and Cecily Harwood counted the fence posts as they passed because there was nothing else to do and no one beside her to speak to. She had been married 11 hours. Her husband had not made the journey with her. He had handed her into the carriage himself, in front of the church, in front of everyone, and said that arrangements had been made and that Mrs. Peel would meet her at the house. Then he had walked back toward the street without turning around, and Cecily had sat very still with her gloves in her lap while the driver clicked his tongue at the horses and they moved away. She had not cried. She had counted fence posts instead. She was still counting. The property appeared at the end of a long drive bordered by elms that had gone unpruned for several seasons. She could see that much before the carriage had even stopped moving. The branches crossed overhead in a tangle, and dead wood had fallen in places and been left where it lay. Beyond the trees, the house rose from a gray November sky, 3 stories of limestone that had once been pale cream and was now the color of old dishwater. Several windows on the upper floor had shutters hanging at angles. One had come off entirely and been propped against the wall below. The driver helped her down without comment. He had been paid to deliver her and he had delivered her. He set her trunk beside the front step and was back on his box before Cecily had taken a proper look at the door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open herself. The entrance hall smelled of cold ash and damp stone. A chandelier hung above her head, with half its candles missing. The floors were good oak, she noticed, wide-planked and solid, but they were thick with dust, and the runner down the center hall had faded to an indeterminate gray. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked. That was the only sound. Mrs. Harwood. The woman who appeared from the back passage was perhaps 60, square-shouldered, with white hair pinned severely and an expression that offered nothing in the way of welcome or warmth. She introduced herself as Mrs. Peel and said that she was the housekeeper, that she had been the housekeeper for 22 years and that she had done what she could with what she had been given, which was very little and getting less. Cecily said she was glad to meet her. Mrs. Peel looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite assessment. Then she said she would show her to her room. The room was clean. That was the best that could be said for it. The bed was made, the grate had been swept, and someone had put a small arrangement of dried flowers on the dresser that had probably been there since the previous summer. The window looked out over what had once been a kitchen garden. Raised beds gone to weeds, a stone wall with a section crumbled away, apple trees with dead branches outnumbering live ones. Cecily set her gloves on the dresser beside the dried flowers. She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she asked Mrs. Peel when the accounts were last reviewed. The first thing she learned was that the property had a name, Harrow Gate, not after her husband's family, which was Harwood, but after a previous owner 2 generations back whose name no one could quite remember. The second thing she learned was that the staff had been reduced to 3. Mrs. Peel, a groundskeeper named Walter, who was 68 and had bad knees, and a kitchen girl named Polly who was 15 and had never worked anywhere else. The third thing she learned, and this took longer because the account books were in a study on the 2nd floor that had been locked, and it required writing a letter to her husband's solicitor in Halifax to obtain the key, which arrived 10 days later without any accompanying note, was that the property was generating income. The farmland to the north was leased. The timber rights on the eastern lot had been sold the previous year. There was a rental cottage on the property boundary that housed a family named Sutherland. All of this was producing money. And yet there was no money. Or rather, there was very little money, and it was arriving in amounts that did not match what the leases described. And the difference was being paid to an estate management firm called Alderson & Cole out of Halifax, whose fees appeared on every quarterly statement, but whose services Cecily could find no record of anyone actually requesting. She made a table. She did this on the back of a sheet of wallpaper she found in the hall cupboard, because proper ledger paper had not been ordered in some time. She listed the lease amounts as written in the original contracts, then the amounts actually received, then the Alderson & Cole fees, and then the difference. She added the columns 3 times because she wanted to be certain. The difference, over 4 years, was not a small number. She set down her pen and looked at what she had written for a long while. The study was cold. The fire had been lit, but the chimney drew poorly, and most of the heat went sideways. And outside the window the November wind was moving through the unpruned elms with a sound like water. She wrote 2 more letters that afternoon, one to the original tenant farmers to confirm the lease terms as they understood them, one to the land registry office in Halifax, requesting copies of the filed agreements. She did not write to her husband. She did not yet know what she would say to him. His name was Reginald Harwood, and she knew very little about him. She had known his name for 4 months before the wedding, and had met him 3 times, each time in a drawing room, with her mother present and his solicitor seated at the far end of a settee, taking notes on things that were never explained to her. He was 41. He had owned the property for 6 years, inheriting it from an uncle whose name she had already forgotten. He had a reputation in Halifax for being difficult. Her mother had said the word difficult in a tone that meant something specific, and then changed the subject. He had married her, apparently, because his family believed it was time, and because the Harwood name required a certain kind of wife for appearances, and because Cecily came from a respectable family in Antigonish that was well regarded if not particularly wealthy, which meant she was appropriate without being in a position to make demands. That was what her cousin had told her the week before the wedding, with the bluntness that Cecily had always either appreciated or resented depending on the day. She had not asked why he had agreed. She supposed it did not matter. What she thought about, on the cold evenings in the study, with the account book spread around her, and the fire doing its inadequate best, was not why he had married her. It was why he had left her here, whether he understood what state the property was in, whether he knew about Alderson and Cole, whether he was the one who had authorized the arrangement. That thought she kept returning to, and could not quite set aside and did not know what to do with. The replies to her letters came in December, 2 weeks apart. The tenant farmers wrote back first, both of them. Thomas Breen, who farmed the north lot, was a careful writer who chose his words slowly, and said that yes, the lease amount was what the contract stated, and that he paid it every quarter, and that he was surprised to be asked because he had assumed his payments were in order. The Sutherland family, in the cottage, wrote a shorter letter that said much the same thing. The land registry office sent copies of the original agreements. The amounts matched what Cecily had found. The amounts did not match what had been deposited into the household account. She added this to her table. Then she wrote to Alderson and Cole directly. She introduced herself as Mrs. Harwood of Harrow Gate and asked, politely and specifically, for documentation of the services rendered under their management contract, a copy of the contract itself, and the name of the individual at Harrow Gate who had authorized the engagement of their firm. She expected them to ignore her. They did not ignore her. They sent a reply within the week, which told her something, and the reply was smooth and practiced, and said that all records were being reviewed, and that she could expect a full accounting in due course. It did not answer any of her 3 specific questions. She read the letter twice. Then she put it with the others in the box she was using to keep her correspondence organized, which was a tea box from the kitchen that Polly had given her after Cecily had admired the size of it. That evening she asked Mrs. Peel, over tea, whether she had ever heard the name Alderson and Cole before. Mrs. Peel set down her cup very slowly. Then she said that she had heard it once, that a man from that firm had visited the property about 4 years ago, while Mr. Harwood was in Halifax, that he had spent 2 hours in the study with the door closed, with a man she didn't know, and left with a folder of papers. Cecily asked who the other man was. Mrs. Peel said she didn't know his name, but that he had arrived in a good carriage and had the manner of someone who was comfortable spending other people's money. She wrote to her husband in January. She had been at Harrow Gate for 2 months by then, and she had, in that time, begun to accomplish things that had not been accomplished in some years. She had found a second groundskeeper, a young man from the nearest village named Declan, who was strong and willing, and asked sensible questions. She and Walter had walked every corner of the property together in the first week, and she had made a list of what needed doing in order of urgency. The collapsed section of kitchen garden wall had been repaired. The shutters on the upper windows had been rehung. The chimney in the study had been swept by a man from town, who charged a fair price and did the job properly, which meant the fire now drew correctly and she no longer spent evenings with her coat on. She had also, with Polly's help, aired every room on the main floor, cleaned the chandelier fixture by fixture, and found, in a locked cupboard in the back hall, 2 dozen jars of preserved fruit that Mrs. Peel had put up herself in September and not been able to use because there was no one to serve them to. Cecily served them. They had blackberry preserves on their toast for 3 weeks. The letter she wrote to her husband was not a warm letter, but it was not a cold one either. She told him what she had found in the accounts. She told him what she had found in the land registry records. She told him about Alderson and Cole. She told him what the discrepancy was, and for how many years it had been occurring, and that she had written to the firm and received a reply that answered none of her questions. She told him she was not certain whether he had known about the arrangement. She told him she was asking directly now. Had he known? She sealed the letter and gave it to Declan to post, and then went back to the study and sat with the fire, which was drawing properly now, and looked at the wall. He came in February. She heard the carriage on the drive and looked out the study window and recognized the horse, a dark bay she had seen once outside the church in Halifax. She set down her pen. She did not go to the front door immediately. She allowed herself 1 full minute to sit still, and then she went. Reginald Harwood was taller than she remembered. He was standing in the entrance hall looking up at the chandelier, which was clean now and had all its candles, and something in his face was not what she had expected, though she was not certain what she had expected. He said, "You cleaned it." She said, "Yes." He turned and looked at her. He had a letter in his hand, which was hers, and he had the particular expression of a man who had been traveling since the day before yesterday, and had thought about something the entire time and arrived, without having resolved it. He said, "I did not know." She held his gaze and said nothing. He said, "I want to be clear about that. I did not know what Alderson and Cole were doing. I did not authorize the fees. I don't know who did, and I intend to find out, and I should have found out myself years ago instead of." He stopped. He looked away from her, toward the hall. It was not an apology exactly. She did not think he was a man who apologized easily, or perhaps at all. But it was as close to one as she thought she was likely to get, and it was, at the very least, honest. She said, "The solicitor's records will show who signed the original contract, your signature or someone else's. That will answer part of it." He looked back at her. There was something in his expression she didn't have a name for quite yet. He said, "You've already thought through how to prove it." She said, "I've had time to think." He stayed 3 weeks. She had not expected him to stay more than 2 days. She did not ask why he stayed. She did not think it would be useful to ask directly, and she suspected he could not have answered clearly if she had. What she observed was that he came to the study in the mornings, after breakfast, and sat across from her at the desk that had room enough for 2 if the account books were stacked rather than spread. And he read through the documents she had organized. And sometimes he asked questions, and sometimes he simply read. On the 4th day he rode out to the north lot and spoke with Thomas Breen himself. He came back quieter than he had left. On the 6th day, a letter arrived from the solicitor in Halifax, a man named Carmichael who had been with the family for 15 years and who had, it emerged, co-signed the original Alderson and Cole contract on behalf of the estate without consulting Reginald. On the ground this in careful, legal language that did not quite obscure the arrogance of it, that the estate required professional management, and that Mr. Harwood had at the time expressed no interest in the details of its administration. Reginald read this letter at the desk in the study with a stillness that was not calm. Cecily watched him from across the table and said nothing. After a long moment he set the letter down and said, "He was not wrong that I had no interest," she said. "That's one way to read it." He looked at her. She said, "Another way is that your lack of interest gave someone room to help himself." "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause, "Both things can be true." She thought that was probably the most honest thing he had said to her yet. She nodded and went back to her own work. She did not know for a long time why he had agreed to the marriage. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself she had sufficient reasons of her own to make a life here regardless of what his reasons were, and that was true. She had always been practical in a way that people sometimes called cold, and she called efficient, and she had found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had come to love Harrow Gate in the month she had been here. Not what it was when she arrived, but what it was becoming. The kitchen garden was being properly dug over for spring. The elms along the drive had been pruned back. She had found, in a box under the staircase, a set of architectural drawings of the house, dated 1887, and in the evenings she had been studying them. And she knew now which walls were original stone, and which had been added later. And she thought the parlor at the back of the house had once had a window on the east side that someone had closed up for reasons she could not determine. She had told herself she did not need to know why. But she was human, and the question remained. It was Polly who answered it, without knowing she was answering anything. One evening in the 3rd week of his visit, Polly was carrying wood to the study, and Reginald was there. And they had a brief exchange about whether the back staircase was easier to carry from or the front, and Polly said the back without hesitation, and then added, with the directness of someone who had never learned when to stop talking, that it was good he had come back because Mrs. Harwood had been working very hard, and the house was looking ever so much better, and it was a shame he hadn't seen it when it was at its worst. because then he would really understand. Cecily, who was pretending to read, waited. Reginald said that he imagined it had been very bad. Polly said it had been bad indeed, and that Mrs. Harwood had not once complained, which Polly clearly found extraordinary. After Polly had gone, Cecily looked up and found him watching her. His expression was the same one from the entrance hall, the first day, the one she did not have a name for. But it was clearer now, less guarded, and she thought she could read it better than she could then. She thought it looked something like recognition. He told her, on the last evening before he returned to Halifax, why he had agreed to the marriage. They were in the parlor, which still did not have the east window she intended to restore, but which now had a fire that worked, and curtains that had been washed and rehung, and chairs that had been reupholstered by a woman in the village who had done the work for a fair price, and done it well. He had brought a bottle of good wine from Halifax, which they had mostly finished, and the conversation had moved through practical things. What Carmichael would be charged with, who would take over the estate accounts, whether the roof above the east wing needed a professional assessment, and then had gone quiet in the way that felt different from ordinary quiet. He said, "My family needed the marriage. That's straightforward, and I expect you know it." She said she had understood as much. He said, "What I told myself was that it would be a reasonable arrangement, that I would marry appropriately, and the property would have a mistress and everyone would be satisfied." He turned his glass in his hands. "I had not given much thought to what you would be satisfied with. I recognize that, on the drive to Halifax after the wedding. It was not a comfortable recognition," she said, "and yet you didn't come back." He said, "No." A pause. "I think I told myself it would be easier to come back once. I don't know, once something had been established, once there was a reason." She said, "The accounts." He said, "Yes, you gave me a reason I could act on, a practical one." He looked at her directly. "I think I needed that." It was not romantic. She did not require it to be romantic. What she thought it was, sitting in the parlor of the house she had been building back piece by piece for 4 months, was the truth, and the truth was something she could work with. She said, "When you come back in spring, the east window should be open again." He said, "You found the drawings," she said, "under the staircase. Someone bricked up that window in 1903. I can't find a reason for it in any of the records." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My uncle bricked it up. He had a particular dislike of morning light." He paused. "I always thought that was a very grim way to live." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed with him, and it surprised them both slightly, and he smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression she had catalogued over the 3 weeks, but something smaller and less managed, and she thought that was probably closer to the actual man. She said, "I'll open it in April." He said, "I'll be here to see it." He was. He arrived the last week of April, when the kitchen garden was showing its first green rose, and the elms along the drive were leafed out fully, and the light through the parlor's restored east window fell across the floor in the mornings in a long rectangle that moved slowly toward noon. She was in the garden when his carriage came up the drive. She had her work gloves on, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a smear of soil on her forearm, and she stood up from where she had been kneeling, and watched him come. He stepped down from the carriage and looked at the drive, at the pruned elms, at the kitchen garden wall that had been repaired over winter, at the house with its shutters all properly hung, and its limestone facade showing pale again, where Declan had cleaned the upper courses with a long-handled brush. He stood and looked at all of this for a long moment. Then he looked at her. She said, "The window is open," he said. "I can see the light from here." He crossed the drive, and she pulled off one glove, and he took her hand, which still had soil on it, and she let him hold it, and they stood in the April light with the garden coming green around them and the house behind them, solid and present, and no longer merely surviving. There was no grand declaration. There had been, she thought, enough of the truth between them now that grand declarations would only clutter it. She put her glove back on and went back to her kneeling, and he fell into step beside her and asked what she was planting, and she told him. The morning moved around them. The east window caught the light and held it. She had not come here to love this place. She had come here because she had been sent, but the place had become hers in the making of it, and perhaps that was how it worked. Not what you were given, but what you built from it. Not the house as it stood on the day you arrived, dusty and cold and waiting, but the house as it became in your hands. She pressed a seed into the turned earth and covered it over, and beside her Reginald Harwood. Her husband, still a partial stranger, someone she was only now beginning to learn, asked whether she thought the apple trees on the north end could be saved with proper pruning, or whether they were too far gone. She said she thought they could be saved. She said she was fairly certain of it.